All right, good evening and welcome to another lovely episode of vBrownBag. Today I'm actually really excited about this episode. Um, Colin wrote a multi-part blog series during Blogtober or October about Terraform, and it was something that I've been working a lot with, and so I'm really excited, and I hope this is the first of several episodes about Terraform. So if Terraform is something that's interesting to you, please reach out to me. Let's get you on the schedule and let's terraform the world. I don't know. So, without further ado, our guest today is Colin Westwater, and I'm your host, Rebecca Fitzhugh. Please feel free to interact with us on Twitter. I will be monitoring Twitter for ideally gifs and funny things to harass Colin or encourage Colin, whatever you prefer there. So make sure you use at vBrownBag or hashtag vBrownBag. And this is actually our last episode of the entire year. So thank you, Colin, for fitting us in before going on holiday. And we'll be back the first week in January. So without further ado, the man of the hour, Colin, I'm going to make you the presenter and you'll be ready to go.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. If you can let me know you can see my screen.
I see the vSphere client. Yes, now I see PowerPoint.
There we go. Well, thanks for the introduction, Rebecca. It's quite an honour to be presenting for the vBrownBag. It's been a goal of mine for a while, so thanks for inviting me. So as Rebecca said, I did a series of blog posts in October about Terraform. So that's why she invited me. So my name's Colin Westwater. I'm a server administrator. I feel like I'm one of the exceptions in IT that I've worked for the same company for 18 years since I was a student. Never had a job interview because I've always worked at the same place. I'm a VCP and a vExpert. There's my Twitter handle, my blog, and GitHub, where I will put the code files that I'm showing you on GitHub straight after this. Okay. So what is infrastructure as code? So I looked it up on Wikipedia, and the definition is infrastructure as code is a process of managing and provisioning computer or data centers through machine-readable definition files rather than physical hardware configuration or interactive configuration tools. So you think what you do just now, and traditionally you go in and you do procedures to build your infrastructure or your VMs. Infrastructure code, basically you tell Terraform what you want it to look like, and Terraform does that for you. Okay. It seems to be the new hotness just now. I really got interested in it when I was following the Virtual Design Master this year because it seemed to feature heavily in that. So it really got my interest up. And it's actually pretty easy to pick up. There's no installer. You can just dive straight in and see results very quickly, which is quite encouraging. When you think of code, you think you're developing and it's a complicated process, but Terraform is pretty easy and straightforward. And about a year ago, Brian Gerard at the Scottish VMUG did a presentation where he was a traditional ops person and he was now more DevOps, writing code, things like that, and I basically laughed thinking, yeah, I'll never be like that, I'll never get to do stuff like that. But here I am a year later, I'm writing code to build VMs and infrastructure. So Brian was right. Terraform, I don't currently use it at work, but we're building new data center infrastructure, so I'm looking to see how we can use it for implementing that. We're a traditional Windows shop, so there's not much changes in the VMs because once they're built, they're pets, not cattle. But we get audited like most people. So when we get audited and they say, what does your infrastructure look like? Instead of doing the traditional screenshots or talking to an auditor, you can simply hand over your code and say, this is how my infrastructure is built, which is a lot easier to do than having to deal with auditors. Okay. Personally, I use it at home in my lab all the time just to tear stuff up and down in the lab. So it's very useful for that as well, not just in your production data center. Okay. So what we'll cover, Terraform terminology, how you install it, how you initialize Terraform to work with vSphere. we're going to do something very simple. We're going to create a new virtual machine. We're going to clone an existing virtual machine. And if we have time, we're going to have a look at about using variables and associated files to make it more modular. Okay, and we'll have a quick look at the documentation on the Terraform website. Okay. So there's some basics about Terraform. Terraform uses a term called providers. So providers are the resources and infrastructure we can interact with in Terraform. This can include things like AWS, Azure, Docker, GitHub, Google Cloud Platform, and obviously vSphere. And it uses API interactions into those platforms to do what you want it to do. Okay. Resources, that's the things you're actually going to create. So in the vSphere realm, it's like creating virtual switches, data stores, virtual machines, heck, even licensing you can control with Terraform. So there's 3 basic stages to working with Terraform. You write your code and you run the Terraform plan. That shows you what it's going to do. And I kind of think of that like in PowerShell when you run what if at the end of your command, and it tells you what it's going to do, but it doesn't actually do it. You apply your code to the infrastructure, it goes off and actually does it. And then when you're finished, you destroy the infrastructure or your VMs. It's all basically three commands to control your infrastructure. The state, that is actually what Terraform thinks of resources you created alike. So when you make changes, say you've got a AWS instance, the state defines what Terraform thinks it looks like. You can change your code, Terraform apply, and it compares what it thinks it looks like, what it needs to look like, and makes the changes appropriately. Okay. So that's enough for the PowerPoint. So I've got a pretty simple lab here. Got vCenter running with 3 hosts. I've got a NFS data store running on this box. And I have a 2012 R2 template built that we'll use later on. Okay. So to install Terraform, website, download. You grab I'm a Windows guy, so Windows 64-bit, and it comes as a zip file with 1 file. That's all you need to do. Extract that. So I've created a folder here called vBrownBag. And to install it, just copy it into that folder, and that's you done installing Terraform. Simple as that. I recommend adding whatever path you extract the executable to your path statement, just makes things easier to work with. But this is a simple demo, so I'm not going to bother with that. Okay. So set up, I've got a command prompt here, browse to that directory. Okay. So the code, the fun stuff. You see here, I've commented out a lot of it, so we'll get down to it. So we're creating a provider, and as I said before, a provider is what you're going to interact with. In this case, vSphere. So something simple. Let's connect to vCenter. So one tip that I find, you need to enter your username as a UPN, not like corp-a-c Westwater. It has to be in this format, like your UPN. Okay. Find your password and your vCenter. So something very straightforward, just to check everything works. So if I try and run Terraform, well, first of all, we'll do a Terraform version. That shows you that it's reading the executable, and you can see we're up to date. Okay. So if I do, next we want to pull the vSphere provider from Terraform, from HashiCorp. So easy, Terraform init. So we're initializing it as reading my code file, which is in the same directory as the executable. Hit return. And it's detecting, it's reading that file and saying, I'm trying to use vSphere, connect with vSphere. So it's downloaded I'll maximize that up. It's gone to the HashiCorp website, check to see what the latest build is, and it's downloaded that provider. And you can see here, Terraform has been successfully initialized. So we're ready to go. And if you browse the directory, it's created a folder, it's got a plugin, and there is the executable for working with the vSphere provider in Terraform. That's it, we're ready to go. So, as I said, first thing you want to do is a Terraform plan. Because all we're doing just now is connecting to vCenter. We've got no changes, your infrastructure is up to date. So as I said, this means that Terraform did not detect any difference between your configuration and real physical resources that exist. So that means no changes will be needed, actions need to be performed. And that's where your state comes in. It's comparing what is actually, what it wants to do and what is actually happening and makes that change. So I'm going to just comment out some of this code and comment that back so it doesn't run. So when I wrote my series, it was a pre-version 1 provider for vCenter, for vSphere. So there's been a lot of changes since I released version 1. So this weekend, when I was getting ready, a lot of the code that I wrote for my blog post didn't work. So there was some quick learning and rewriting. So first of all, we want to create the data for the resources, which if you remember is what you're actually creating. And in our case, we're going to create a VM from scratch and then clone a virtual machine. So there is some requirements when you're creating, say, a virtual machine. If we look at the help website, we go down here. Hold on. You can see here they've got examples, but down here you can see the arguments. So there is some required fields that we need to use in the resource. So we're going to define the data for the resource. So for instance, we can see here my vSphere data center. We're using a vSphere data center, and we're going to give it a name. So DC, and then we're actually putting in the name of my vCenter. I can prove that by going here. There's my data center console. Okay. We're also going to need a data store to store the virtual machine. So we're getting a vSphere data store. We're going to pick a name for that data store. And then here is the actual name of the data store in vCenter. So if I put this back up here, you can see the NFS data store. So it matches what you have in vCenter. And then you'll see here data center ID. And that is doing an API call back to vCenter and getting the ID of all your objects. And from what I understand, you can see those through the Manage Object browser that's part of vCenter, but that's obviously enabled by disabled by default now for the latest versions, but you can enable it if you want to poke around it. So you can see that it's pretty simple. We're pulling the data from our VC data center, which is called DC, and we're getting the ID of that data center. So we're querying our Contoso data center for a data store called NFS data store. Okay. We also want a data store. We could just reuse, because I have my ISO in the same data store, I could have just reused that. But just to make things clear, I've created another data point called ISO data store. Okay. We need a resource pool. So I've got one pre-created called Terraform. And again, that's just pulling the ID via API calls to your vCenter. VM network from a networking. And later on, we will create vCenter for a template called 2012 R2 template. So that's just defined all our data that we're going to need to use. So again, I can run a Terraform plan. And again, because we've not actually created or destroyed or done anything to our resources, we're up to date. All we've just done is define what our data for the code. So let's create a VM. Just comment that out. So here we go. So we're building a 2012 2012 R2 virtual machine. So we're creating a resource, which is of a type vSphere virtual machine, and our resource is called new VM. So these are the actual things we're going to start, the data we're going to actually use to build that virtual machine. So the name, that's what we want to call it, the actual virtual machine in vCenter. We need to use a resource pool, and the data store ID we have defined up here in our data section. So you can see that matches our data, vSphere data store, and data store ID, which you can see we have defined up here. We want one CPU, 2 gig of RAM, and some of these we don't actually need to define. If we look at here, all we need to define is the name of the virtual machine, the resource pool, and where it's going to, which data store it's going to live on, and the disk, and the network interface. So we don't technically have to define number of CPUs because there's a default Terraform will use of 1 and memory of 1 gig. But just to show what you can do, I put this in. We're going to say it's a guest ID, which is you can look up on the SDK documentation in VMware.com. We're going to use an LSI Logic SAS SCSI type controller. And this here, I've just set this to 0. So what it'll do is when it's building your virtual machine, Terraform will wait until that virtual machine comes on the network. It has connectivity, and Terraform can see it come live. And then it'll say, Terraform will say, right, I've created that virtual machine as you wanted. It'll say everything's complete. But I don't want us to sit around waiting for a virtual machine to build. So I've just said, assume immediately that everything's worked. So it's 0 minutes. Okay. So that's just created the outline of the virtual machine, define some basic variables. Next, we need to define the network interface. And again, all we're pulling is the network ID from that data we defined up above, which is there. And then we want to create a disk. So we're going to call it 2012 R2VM.vmdk. We're going to define a size, and we're going to say it's been provisioned. And again, these are optional. You don't have to create them, but I've thrown them in so we can see some of the things we can do. Then finally, when we're creating the VM, we also need to point it towards an ISO file so the virtual machine will build. So that's where I've used my ISO data store data from up above, and the path in that data store is ISO/2012 R2.ISO. So you kind of think writing code is complicated, but you can see here, I could create a virtual machine, if I strip this down, probably in about 8 lines of code. So it's very easy to do. And you can get as complex as you want. If you click down, you can see here, you can add or enable hot add. You can define number of cores per socket, memory hot add. You can set the boot delay on the virtual machine, as like going through the VM options in vCenter. You can set the BIOS type. You can run VMware tool scripts. Your resource allocations. So you can read anything you can basically do through the GUI, you can do through Terraform. And this seems to be a big change from the pre-version 1 provider Terraform put out. So as I said, they've done a lot of work since I looked at it in October to give a really good experience with vSphere. So back to the code. That's us ready to go. So I'm going to save that because there we go, because I made the comments. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to do a Terraform plan. So Terraform is run. Let's grab the data. Let's check the state, grab the data, and it says it's ready to do something, and it's going to create something. And it's going to create a virtual machine called new VM. And we can see here are all the options for the VM. And I kind of think that looks like the VMX file for the virtual machine. So you can see here, there's my CD-ROM path to the ISO file. There's my VMD key name, the size of it, then provisioned. So some of those data values we haven't defined, it's picked default values for, and we've said let's pick some other values we want to be specific with. So it says we're going to add one virtual machine, zero change, zero destroy. So we're ready to go. So we do Terraform apply. So it says, are you sure you want to create a virtual machine? Yes. It's going off and doing it. If we go back to vCenter, it's completed. We have created one VM called new VM. If we go back to vCenter, you can see there's our VM. Let's open the console just to prove it's attached to ISO. And there we are. There's Windows starting to load and boot up. So good, the code's worked. That's the beauty of being able to plan it. You can check to see before you apply if everything's working. So there we go, ready to start installing. So I'm not going to bother keeping on with that. So the last part of the VM lifecycle in Terraform, we're going to do a Terraform destroy. Because we don't want that virtual machine. So you can see there, Terraform will perform the following actions. It's going to work in new VM and it's going to destroy it. Are you sure you want to destroy? Yes. Terraform destroyed, VM has gone. So as simple as that. You can create and destroy virtual machines just by running Terraform apply. You see there, and Terraform destroy. Yes. So that's what I like about Terraform. It's so quick to see results, and you can see it happening right in front of you. Things are working correctly. So that's a pretty good example. But you know, who's going to create a virtual machine from scratch? We usually use templates. So I've got a template here, pre-built. It's been built, sys-prepped, and then shut down, converted to template. So let's go back and comment out that. So there's a lot of the similarities for creating a template, but there are some different changes. So this time we're going to create a virtual machine called clone, and the actual VM name is going to be 2012 R2 clone. And again, we have to pick a resource pool and a data store to store that virtual machine. So we're going to have one CPU, 1 gig of RAM. Now here is where there's a slight change. So our guest ID, up there we defined that before as a Windows 8 server guest, 64-bit guest. Well, we just want to pick that value up automatically from the template. So if you remember up here, we defined template, which was pointing to vCenter to that 2012 R2 template. So we scroll back down here. We are querying vCenter, which then queries a template to find what template, what guest ID that the template is using. So we don't have to find it here. Terraform will ask vCenter to supply that value for you. And again, for the SCSI type, vCenter is going to go and query the template and grab that data for you. Same with the network interface, the name, we still got to set that. We're going to grab the size of the template, keep it the same, and we're going to set if it's thin provisioned and eager or lazy zeroed. Okay, and then here we go. Clone. Here's the clone operation, and we're just grabbing the template ID from vCenter. Pretty straightforward. So let's save that. So we're going to do Terraform plan. So again, here we go. So we're doing a virtual machine clone. You can see here we have not defined the disk size. So you can see that it's pulled that from my that value from my template by using that field there. Same with the guest ID. It's queried it, it's fine as a Windows 8 Server 64 guest, etc. So plan, we're going to add one virtual machine to vCenter. So let's apply it. Okay, again, it's going to tell you what it's going to do. Are you sure you want to do it? Yes. Right, vCenter is going to go off. See that? It's created the clone, and now it's working away to create that clone virtual machine. And when it's done, it's automatically going to power on that virtual machine for me. So, pretty straightforward. I know it takes about 7 minutes to clone this. I'm running it in a nested workstation, so I'm limited by my disk performance. So 7 minutes, that virtual machine will be created. It'll be powered on, and we're good to go. And then Terraform will report back then that the virtual machine has been created and is powered on and accessible. So I think what I will do is I'm going to leave that running in the background, and we'll come back to it and have a look. So you see, one of my complaints when I looked at Terraform before, the documentation wasn't that great. But it looks like the HashiCorp have really worked in getting that documentation up to date. So they've got some great examples here. And then they've really worked in defining what you need to do to create, to work in Terraform. So when we're doing our clone operation, we're doing something pretty simple. We're just creating an exact replica. With a clone operation, you can, let me scroll down, find the right part. So there is a whole load of options you do with the clone as well. So if you want to go in and say, right, that the clone needs to have an IP address, you can define that in the code in Terraform. And Terraform will then set those IP addresses, your gateways, all that DNS, all those sorts of things. There's your gateway, DNS. There's separate options for Linux operating systems that you can choose. And these Windows customizations as well, where you can even set the computer name, join it, set a work group or a domain, and even set an admin password. So it's very powerful. Usually you would use something like Terraform to build your virtual machine, and then maybe use a tool like Puppet or Ansible to actually work on the operating system side. But it seems Terraform now can actually get into the OS and do some changes in the operating system. So those lines, I think, maybe be getting a bit blurred. So you can see that there's quite a lot of options you can do with a clone operation, set your product key, even run the command once when the user first logs in. So it's very powerful when working with Windows. And as I said, I'm a Windows guy, not a Linux guy, so this is where I've been concentrating on and playing with. You can even go down and supply your own sysprep file. So it's pretty good stuff. So let's see. So we're about halfway there in creating that virtual machine. So we'll leave that running just now. So the problem with this, not the problem, but as I said, I'm not a developer, but I understand this may be not best practice where we have things like our credentials hard-coded in this file. We've got our actual data hard-coded in here, like number of CPUs and virtual machine. It doesn't make the system very modular. So this is a bit more advanced. So I'm going to open another folder. There we go. And it's remembered. So here is my same file, but I'm using variables for things like my username, my password, my vCenter, my disk name, my guest ID, things like that, even the name of the virtual machine. So this makes the actual Terraform file more generic. so you don't have to keep diving in here to make small changes. So the next part of that is you've created this file with your variables. You next need to define your variables. So you can see here, before I had my username, my password, and my vCenter, and I've created those variables of a type string. So most of these are string, and then just to show you, you can put in a description for that variable. And obviously you want to put in your description, try and comment as much as you can, so the next person that comes and looks at it understands what you're wanting to do. Name, number of CPUs, OS type, disk name, size, and ISO. I've just defined those as variables in a file called variables.tf. Okay, so where do we actually put the data? Well, we've got a file called terraform.tf vars, which is your variables file. Terraform will by default look for a file of that exact name and then use the data in that file automatically in your actual Terraform file. So you can see here, this is where I'm defining my username, my password, vCenter, and then things like my data center name, my data stores that I had before, the resource pool, VM name, VM network, CPUs, OS type, my disk name, the size of the VMDK, and the ISO path. So that lets you now leave that main Terraform file as is, and say you wanted to create a second virtual machine or adjust the one you had, you can just go in there, change it there, instead of having to dive into this code. So it makes it more modular, and it's probably best practice for when you're working as a developer. But don't quote me on that because I'm not one. So let's save that. Still going, so I'm going to create a new command prompt. And now I'm going to go back to that vBrownBag 2. Okay. So let's do a Terraform plan. Now I've already initialized it with the vSphere provider, so I don't need to do an initialization. So let's do a plan. There you go then. There we go. We're getting the exact same result that we had before. There's our, we're going to create a new virtual machine. We're going to call it 2012 R2VM. All the same things we did before. We're going to add one virtual machine. So let's apply it. Do you want to apply it? Yes. Okay. It's going to vCenter. There we go. There's a virtual machine we created before. Just prove it. Let's put it in correctly. There we go. Easy. So let's get rid of it. Done. And you can see there's the recent stuff. Deleted that virtual machine. Pretty good stuff. Easy to do. And you can see here, our clone operation from before has finished. So we go back here. It still hasn't detected that virtual machine is up, but it will in a minute. So we go back in here. Let's open the console. There you go. That's just ready to put in the administrator name. And obviously we could do that from Terraform, but just for this simple example, I chose not to do that. But you can put in defined like the default local administrator password. Check that's still in. So there we go. It's completed. It's detected the clone virtual machine on the network and it says we're complete. We've added that cloned. So let's get rid of clean up after ourselves. Oh, hold on. Yes. It's working in the background and it's going to destroy that virtual machine. So that was a very quick high-level overview of how Terraform works. As I said, if you're interested in seeing this code, I will put it on my GitHub later on tonight, so you can have a look at it. So you might be thinking, well, what's the point in that example? You could have quite easily done that in PowerCLI. Yes, you can. But with Terraform, you've got the advantages of having the state file, and you don't just have to work with the vSphere in what you're working with Terraform. You could create a virtual machine in vSphere. You could create an Azure VM or AWS, or even Google Cloud Platform. So with this file, you could create a full stack and multiple pieces of infrastructure with one piece of code. So you can't do that with PowerCLI. You've got to maybe pull in multiple tools or multiple command lines, or you learn different API calls. With this, as long as you know Terraform, you can work in multiple pieces of infrastructure all with one file. And that's it. So
that was
awesome. I hope you'll find that interesting. I should say as well, I just picked an example of building a virtual machine with Terraform. If we scroll back up to the top here, you don't just have to work with virtual machines. You can work with your data center, your data stores, tags, disks, folders. You could start with a blank vCenter and can build your entire virtual infrastructure from scratch, and then build your virtual machines as well, or your templates. So it's very powerful. I'm really excited about how this is going, and I'm looking forward to learning more about it.
Awesome.
So that's me.
We did have one question come in for you, Colin. Yep. So this is from one of your fellow Scots, so, be prepared to heckle him back. He said,
well, I'm either going to get him I'm going to either buy him a drink or get him in the public after.
He said, can you integrate Terraform with VRO, or does that not make much sense? So the one thing I'll say here is keep in mind that Terraform can be used as a provider for VRA.
Well, I would assume yes then. I do not have any experience with the VRO, so I'm not going to say 100%, but from what you said, I would say yes. I mean, when you look at the providers that are available, if we go to all providers, I scroll down, you've even works with vCloud Director. So I'm pretty sure if it doesn't, it will, because this is continually being updated.
Right. Yeah, so for me, I would say, the typical kind of architect answer of it depends, right? It kind of depends on what you're using Terraform for. Because, potentially, like, I could even see, if you're really trying to do like kind of a, if you will, like a first class sort of infrastructure as a service type offering, that you could use VRA as sort of that portal, right? And then have Terraform provisioning, not just virtual machines, right? But well beyond that. So in some cases, you could even kind of use Terraform in replace of VRO rather than in conjunction with. So I think it really just depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
It just depends what tool is best for your needs. But, as I said, this is being updated all the time. Even in the month and a bit, there's been so big changes to the vSphere provider. So if it doesn't do it now, watch this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, let me double check and make sure that there was no more questions that came in. All right. Well, that looks like it. Brian did say he did mean VRA instead of VRO. So then I would say, yeah, that does make sense. Cool. Thanks for the clarification there, Brian. Cool. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Colin. I really appreciate, number one, the blog series you did. I thought it was fantastic. And then following that up and showing us live how you've used it. So really great presentation. Thank you.
No problem. My demo gods were kind to me tonight.
All right. With that, that concludes another episode of vBrownBag. So please tune in to our YouTube channel, or of course, follow us on Twitter.